Afternoon, everyone. Some people coming in. While we're waiting for people to arrive for the first minute or two, if you guys want to just write in the chat who you are, what you're working as, and what you'd like to get out of today, it would be really nice to see who's here with us today, because I can't see you otherwise. Anna. We've got people coming in from all over today, so it'll be interesting to see where people are based. Plymouth, Coventry. And if there's anything in particular you really wanted to get out of this webinar, do let me know in the chat and I will do my best to make sure we cover it. The escalation tips, there's one that's going to be covered. That's good. The escalation as well, that's always a popular one. So empowering clients in a constructive way in terms of managing difficult and challenging situations. That's a lovely, lovely one. Hopefully we will be taking that approach today in a psychologically informed way. People across lots of different types of services as well. Simon, how to look after yourself in stressful situations. I'm glad you brought that up. That will also be covered today. That's a really important part of this, actually, to look after ourselves as well. $35 people so far. We'll give people one more minute and then we'll make a start. Preventing vicarious trauma. Excellent. We will definitely touch on that towards the end as well. Thank you, Kenny. Maria wants to learn about different approaches to clients who present in crisis. Yeah, so everyone's muted. This is a webinar format, so we can't see or hear any of you. So if you're sitting there thinking, oh, there's no mute button, can they hear me? We can't hear you. The only way you can interact with us is via the chat and the Q&A, so please do that. But don't worry, we can't hear you. Okay, I'm going to make a start because it's we've got 2 hours today, so more people might drip through, but we will begin. So a bit of housekeeping, first of all. As I said, we've got 2 hours today and there will be a comfort break in the middle. This is a webinar, so I'm going to just talk at you for a couple of hours. I've tried to make it a little bit interactive. There'll be places where I've asked you questions and you've all just had a practice using the chat. So hopefully we'll get a little bit of back and forth going. And you can drop questions into the Q&A, which is actually separate from the chat at any time, and there'll be a couple of places where I'll try to pick those up. Obviously, step away from the computer if you need to, but we're covering quite a lot today, so If you miss something, it's not a problem. The recording will be sent out to you. So that's how you'll get access to the slides again. So if there's a slide that's quite busy and has a lot of information on it, don't worry about scribbling it all down. You'll get access to the recording, and then you can screenshot the slide as well if you go along. So it's worth noting that because we're talking about crisis management, there's no explicit material, but sometimes it can bring things up for us personally. So just be aware of your own well-being today. And if you're feeling triggered or distressed at all, you can let us know. You can usually private message people in the chat. So you can let us know through that function, or there's some email addresses here. So you've got Amanda's email address, who's been one of the people organising this conference today. We've got Mark, who's actually with us today, who's the safeguarding lead, so you can email him. And there's my email address there if you specifically wanted to get in touch with me afterwards. So what are we going to cover today? So as I said, we've got lots to cover, and hopefully your questions will be answered along the way. So we're going to start off thinking about what constitutes a crisis. What are we talking about? Then we're going to think about ourselves. So starting with us, how do we respond to crises and critical situations? And that's going to include a little look at our fight, flight, freeze response. So our evolutionary response to threat. We're going to talk about crisis prevention, and specifically there'll be a section on sort of anger. So dealing with clients who might present us with sort of aggression or challenging behaviour, and thinking about both preventing that, and then de-escalating that in the moment. We're going to think about conflict resolution in general, so strategies to escalate and de-escalate conflict. And along the way, we're going to have a practice that adds a few tools. So one of them is called Attend and Befriend, and that's a really nice one for reflecting back on a conflict. It's not one to use in the moment, but it's a reflective tool to help us learn from things. There's a section on assessing risk of harm to self, so clients who are at risk of harming themselves, and how to do that effectively. And then the last section is about critical incident stress debriefing. So when a crisis has occurred, an incident has occurred, what can we do? How can we learn from it? How can we move forward? And how can we look after ourselves? So that goes to the vicarious trauma point that someone made in the chat. So let's start with some definitions. So what are we talking about when we think about critical incidents? So really, this is quite idiosyncratic. It could be a medical emergency. It could be a communication problem. It could be an interaction which made you feel inadequate or just left you feeling triggered. It could be that you've been confronted. It could be something that happened which made you sort of question your beliefs or the way you see the world. So critical incidents can relate to communication, knowledge, treatment, relationships, emotions. It can be a whole range of things. Basically anything that happens in a work situation, or I guess any situation, some of this is applicable to broader life, which impacts you and leaves you needing some support, or leaves someone else needing some support. And the definitions of crisis, these are some textbook definitions here. So a crucial or decisive point or situation, especially a difficult or unstable situation involving an impending change. So a crisis is this moment that comes upon us unexpectedly, and we need to decide very quickly what to do. And there's going to be significant consequences depending on how we respond in this moment. And usually it's emotionally stressful or traumatic. So it can also be a point where conflict has reached its highest tension and needs to be resolved. So in an acute situation, something needs to be done quickly. And I guess that's why we're all here today, is to sort of have that question answered, like, what is it that we do? What's the best way to actually respond when we have these crisis moments? So I'm afraid there is no magic word. So that's normally the first question people come in with. It's like, what do I say? I've had this asked of me a lot as a psychologist. So I've just realised I haven't introduced myself properly, but hopefully you've read the blurb. So I'm a clinical psychologist by profession, and I work in the homelessness sector. In-house in a homeless hostel for half the week, and then doing trainings and reflective practice facilitation for the other half. And I quite often get asked, people will come up to me and say, oh, someone's shouting in reception, what do we say? But unfortunately, there isn't just one magic word in a crisis that's suddenly going to make it all go away. All we can do in a crisis is just respond the best we can. And more importantly, prepare for it. So we've got a big section on the preparation in a little while. So before we move on to that, we're going to think about ourselves. So obviously, because we're not in a group today, we can't do this as a group chat, but maybe sort of jot a few notes down for some self-reflection. You can do that in the break, you can do that after this, you can take it to a team meeting perhaps. This would be a nice thing to bring to a reflective practice in your teams, or a team meeting with colleagues, and this slide in the next slide. So just be making some mental notes as I go through these points. So we are sort of the center of our world in a crisis, and the first thing that we can do is be aware of our own triggers, our own beliefs, our own experiences, which are going to cause us to react in different ways to a crisis. And the more self-aware we are, the more we'll be able to manage our responses in the moment. So in our jobs, we often come across death, suicide, self-injury. And actually, these topics are really heavy. They challenge us as human beings. It's sort of existential in terms of our self-awareness around these. Culturally, we also have really deeply held beliefs about anger and its expression. So in certain aspects of culture, so it might be in prisons, anger is sort of socially acceptable, the preferable way to express yourself, whereas some people may have grown up in families where it wasn't okay to express anger at all. So we're all going to have different beliefs about what anger means and whether we're okay around it or not. So these ideas come from family, they come from culture, they come from religious influences, they come from kind of when we were born, which era we were born in. It changes across time and across the world. One thing that doesn't change across time and across the world is that as mammals, we all have a strong fight and flight response when we're subject to violence or aggression. So even if you're very well prepared, and even if you're generally sort of a very calm person, if being confronted with violence and aggression will trigger your own threat system. And we all might have slightly different default responses to this. So again, being aware of your own default is going to really help you to sort of manage it. Which is this last point here. You can't change these default responses, but we can bring our awareness into the situation. So in terms of these questions that you might just want to reflect on at another time, you can think about a recent crisis, or you can think about just in general, how you react when situations are difficult. How do people around you act, and how does that impact you? So does it really affect you when other people are panicking and running around? Are you able to stay calm, or do you actually take on other people's stress quite easily? And then we can go a bit deeper and think, well, how do our personal beliefs influence our reactions? So for example, if a client was swearing at me, would that just kind of roll off me and I wouldn't mind? Or would that impact on a deeply held belief that I hold, maybe about the implication of swearing, what that means about respect, and actually might that upset me more than it might upset somebody else? So in other words, are we aware of our own triggers? And taking time to reflect on our triggers is really helpful, because it gives us that little moment to be able to just see it coming a bit more in a crisis, rather than it catching us completely off guard. So hopefully we're all aware of this idea of fight and flight. This is a little graphic, very rudimentary graphic of our brains. And the idea of this is that we have sort of 3 levels of our brain. So we have this has slightly been updated now over time with new research, but it's still a useful model to think about. We talk about having sort of I call it the caveman brain. I know there have been books published about sort of the chimp brain, but really what we're talking about is this instinct, this fight and flight. And we are born with our neurological fight and flight system ready to go. It should always be the strongest system in your brain. Because if a bus was coming towards you when you were crossing the road, you don't want to be thinking, oh, that's the 33, I missed that bus yesterday. You want to just get out of the way without thinking about it. So it's evolutionarily really helpful that this system is the strongest in a threat situation. However, when that's part of our brain takes over, it's going to shut down our higher brain functions. So our capacity to reflect, our capacity to see other people's points of view, which is often really important in a crisis situation. So one thing that we know and we can plan for is that our ability to reflect, think, problem solve, and empathize with someone else's point of view is going to be impaired in a crisis. So this is why planning ahead is really, really important. So in terms of the fight and flight, again, most people are really aware of what that means. So we get our cortisol coursing through us, adrenaline, your heart's racing, you're shaking, you get sort of tunnel vision, you might need to go to the bathroom. So these are all our kind of classic fight and flight responses. But the other one, which we often overlook, is the freeze response. So the freeze response comes after the fight and flight if those haven't worked. So the best way to think about this is if you've watched, I don't know, a dog chasing a squirrel in a park or a cat chasing a mouse, and think about what this little prey has done. So it probably can't fight. That's not going to work because it's much smaller than the predator. So it's out of fight and flight. It's going to try to run away. But then what happens if you get cornered? Well, what we tend to see is that the mouse, the squirrel, the prey is going to freeze. And actually, this is really helpful from an evolutionary point of view, because what that does is it reverses physiologically the fight and flight response. So where your blood pressure was very high, your heart was racing, when you go into freeze mode, your blood pressure will drop, everything slows down. So sort of in animals or from a physical point of view, this is good because if the mouse gets bitten by the cat, it might bleed out slower and it might be less likely to die. This also creates a numbing effect. So when you're in this freeze mode, you get sort of chemicals released which are pain killing, as is adrenaline actually. So you're less likely to feel that pain. And then this is less applicable to humans, but in mice and squirrels, sometimes the predator will just get bored. If they think that the prey is already dead, they'll just leave it alone. So actually, this is a hugely helpful response. But if we go into this response, so I'm an automatic freezer, and I need to be aware of that because in a crisis situation, I'm going to stand there. I know that about myself, and it's really helpful in a team to know who's going to freeze, who's going to start shouting, who's going to be level-headed and call the police. And it's not about feeling bad about these things. It's about utilizing your team's strengths and weaknesses. So if you notice your colleagues are freezing up a bit, you can guide them away. If you're a flyer rather than a fighter. And yeah, just bringing your awareness to this can help you to manage it in the moment. And if possible, in a minute we're going to talk about some strategies to ground and calm ourselves. You might be able to bring yourself down out of this as well if you're expecting it. The other thing, just as a side note to say about the freeze response, is that if somebody's had lots of early trauma, this will most likely be their default response. So you may work with clients, or you yourself may be a person who dissociates quite a lot. So dissociation is essentially the freeze response. In extreme forms of this, you can have people actually fainting or passing out or disconnecting completely, zoning out in the room. And again, from an evolutionary point of view, this has served them well in their life, because as a child, if we can't run away or fight, this dissociative disconnection is going to keep us safe, at least psychologically, by sort of taking us out of the situation. That's freeze response. So part one, in practice, where are we up to? In a crisis, we struggle to think clearly. We'll struggle to process information, actually. So if you're having to report back to the police later, it's really common that you might have gaps in your memory if you were really scared or upset. And it's really common that you might have a different version of events from a colleague. So it doesn't mean that somebody's lying or made something up. It means that in a crisis, our memory systems are processing things differently. And we will miss things. However, we can predict likely incidents in the places that we work in. We know the sorts of things that are likely to crop up. So it sounds really boring, but knowing your policies and procedures is actually really important. There's a reason that we have them. And as a team, it's great to review these so that in an incident, you know off the top of your head what to do. And just to make this really clear, this is about helping out this kind of frontal lobe part of your brain, which is going to be shut down in practice. So you're sort of planning ahead for your future self who's in fight and flight mode or in freeze mode here. So the other thing you can do is drill your emergency procedures. Obviously, we have fire drills, but it's helpful in a team to practice things like what happens if a client is feeling suicidal, what happens if a client assaults another client. So drilling these emergency procedures so you know what to do. Everyone should have a role. So the hostel that I work at, on the shift sheet in the morning, there's somebody who's a named person who's usually the shift lead who's going to do the seek and search if there's a fire drill. So they know that gets read out on handover. So on that day, if there's a fire, we don't have to sort of go running around thinking who's going to do seek and search, because that person knows that's me, my job for the day. And then any sort of helpful emergency information, whether it's in Westminster, we have single point of access. So we've got the number, we've got the on-call manager number stuck up. Because again, the last thing you want to be doing in an emergency is running around looking for phone numbers. Prepare, prepare, prepare. That's the moral of this story. So the next part that we're going to move on to is specifically around anger. So we thought about preparing ourselves. We can also support the people that we're working with to predict their own triggers, and maybe even support them to manage their responses. So preventing crises is far, far more effective than managing them in the moment, because there is no magic word. So the first thing we can do is understand that anger and aggression are really effective defensive strategies against a perceived threat. There's usually a reason that somebody's behaving like that. And normally it's because it's been effective before. So again, you can apply this to life. It might be the person on the bus who's yelling at the bus driver. There'll be a reason that this is happening. They're probably having a really bad day. And as human beings, we just have a tendency to think, oh, that person's being rude, that person's being difficult. But psychologically informed practice 101 is to sort of look beneath that behavior. So rather than making assumptions about the personality of the person, figuring out what's underneath the anger. So with the people you're supporting, you can help them to predict the triggers. In the moment, if a person has been triggered, the best thing we can do is not react to the anger. So in a second, I'm going to show you a graphic called an anger iceberg. But if you can, in the moment, responding to what you think is underneath the anger iceberg is more effective. Because if responding to the anger could result in sort of fighting fire with fire. So if you think actually this person's angry because they're scared, they're frustrated, they've been triggered, staying calm, reminding the person that they're safe, reminding them that you want to help is probably the most effective thing that we can do. I've just put a note on here because in my experience, one team frustration that we have, which unfortunately I don't have an answer for, is that the emergency services and statutory services don't always support us with the preventative approach. So one thing that happens a lot is when we can see somebody's mental health deteriorating and we're predicting that an incident is going to occur over the next few days or weeks, but for example, CMHT might feel that the risk isn't high enough yet to do anything about it, or two residents are having an argument and we phone the police and they say, well, no one's got hurt yet, so we're not going to do anything about it. And it's just a note to empathise with the fact that it's really frustrating when you're trying to prevent, and the services who are supposed to be supporting you are saying, oh, well, the incident hasn't happened yet, so we're not going to do it. So here's our anger iceberg, and finally a chance for you guys to interact with me. So here's the question: what are some common triggers, some anger triggers for the people that you support in your services? So hold in mind this graphic that anger is often the surface level behavior that we see, and underneath anger there's usually something else going on. There's usually fear of rejection, there's usually shame and humiliation, fear, hurt, frustration. There might be lots of other things going on, which is actually sort of informing our understanding of why this person in front of us is behaving in an aggressive way. So in the chat, drop me some common anger triggers. We'll see how many we can get. So for those of you who aren't sure where that is, there should be a little button on the bottom of your screen that says chat. It looks like a little speech bubble. And that should open a pop-up box and you should be able to type in the pop-up box. Okay, Victoria says coming off drugs or alcohol, definitely. So being either under the influence of substances or withdrawing from substances is more likely to make people feel really irritable and angry. Benefit sanctions, yeah, any kind of sanctions really, being told no, certainly. Being excluded, yeah, and again this is touching on sort of deep wounds that people have. If they've been told no, if they've not had their needs met throughout their life, if they've been excluded and marginalized throughout their life, then something that might seem like quite a small trigger in and of itself can bring up a lot of pain. Speaking of pain, so Corey says pain, yeah, we can all empathise with this. Being in pain makes you really irritable. Feeling trapped, certainly. Being refused a hostel space, yeah, again, not getting your needs met. Lack of sleep, 100%. I know myself, if I often think this at work, that if I miss one meal or if I miss one night of sleep, I am so grumpy. And actually the guys who live in our hostel, they're so sleep deprived, they don't bother to eat because that's not sort of their priority in the day, even if food's available. You know, they're hungry, they're dehydrated, they're tired, of course they're going to be irritable. PTSD, definitely. So again, people often forget that anger outbursts, I'm doing little bunny ear quotes around that, is actually a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder when you're diagnosing it. And so many of the people we work with have PTSD or complex PTSD. Jim says people not getting what they want instantly. Definitely. And actually, this is the topic of the training today is crisis management, but in a complex trauma training, we spend quite a lot of time talking about how the brain is affected when someone experiences a lot of complex trauma through their early life. And there's a lot of impacts in adulthood. So impulsivity, not being able to be patient, that's an example of a sort of a neurological impact of complex trauma. And one thing I hear people saying a lot is, oh, they're an adult, they should be able to wait 5 minutes. They're an adult, they should be patient. And actually that isn't quite right. When someone's had a lot of difficult experiences, literally on a physiological, neurological level, they may not be able to do that. It's not to say that people can't learn and people can't develop, but my perspective is that we should take the shoulds out of it when it comes to things like this. Food and sleep again, feeling accused of something, yeah, and again this is natural, isn't it? Any of us, if you accuse me of something, I'm going to feel defensive, and we're gonna come on to that actually in a minute. And feeling judged and discrimination, yeah, And again, we're working with people who have been consistently marginalised in society, consistently discriminated against through their life. So even a hint that somebody is telling them no or discriminating against them is going to bring up a lot of really strong emotions. Okay, good work, guys. So I think we've pretty much hit all of these. So being told no, previous trauma, difficult anniversaries, that's one actually that it links in with the PTSD, but we haven't said that specifically. So in terms of planning ahead, it's really helpful if you're working with people for a while, or if you're in a residential service, to note down triggering anniversaries for them. It's going to be very helpful, because you're going to know when they come down perhaps in a really bad mood one day, or maybe they withdraw, you think, oh, actually this was the anniversary of their mum's death, so this is going to be a really tough day for them. And it doesn't mean that you have to talk to them about it, it's just to hold in your mind so that you can understand their behaviour. So all the emotions under the anger iceberg there, for example, shame, fear, sadness, frustration, etc. The physical ones, we've mentioned all of these: hunger, sleep, physical health problems. And again, we're working with people who often have lots of multiple and chronic physical health problems or chronic pain. And we've said being under the influence of substances or withdrawing from substances. So, good work. So how do we work with this with people? So again, this is if you're a service, if you're a day centre or a service who doesn't work with people over the long term, this one is hard or perhaps impossible to do. But if you do see people repeatedly, or you're a residential service, you should definitely have sort of collaborative safety plans or collaborative crisis plans with clients. So there's two versions of this, and when we talk about suicidality, we can talk about a crisis plan in terms of keeping safe, but this would be safety planning in terms of risk to others. So helping people to think to themselves, you know, what are my main triggers? What makes me upset? Then thinking about how we can avoid those triggers or prepare for them. And in an ideal world, people aren't always able to articulate this. And again, I mean, I'm not always sure if I lost my temper and my friend said to me, what would you like me to do when you lost your temper? There's not a magic wand, so I might not be able to give you a concrete answer. But for some people, they are actually able to tell you. I remember having worked with somebody for a little while, so they had engaged with psychology for a while, and they were getting very, very angry in reception one day. And the most amazing thing was I was trying to give them a piece of good news that was actually going to calm them down. But in the middle of, you know, being just so angry and throwing things and shouting, they actually managed to say to me, they said, I can't hear you right now. I'm so angry that I can't hear you. I need you to give me time. Which was absolutely incredible that they were able to articulate that. So we gave him 10 minutes, he went upstairs, calmed down, and then I went upstairs and spoke to him. So if you can get this sort of level of communication with your clients to actually understand what they need specifically, then you can have that. And again, this is sort of consistent team approach. So ideally we want this somewhere where anyone can access it. So on your clinical note system, we use Inform. Presumably we'll use different systems, but having it there so that people can access it, even if it's somebody who doesn't normally work with that person, and they can see, oh, when this person's upset, this is how they like to be responded to. So informing that, we can think about what are the strategies that have helped in the past. So if someone's having a tough time thinking, well, I don't know what to do when I'm upset, I don't know what's going to help. Trying to think about, well, the last time this happened, what was helpful and what wasn't helpful, and trying to kind of think from that. Learning and practicing these strategies we're going to do next. And then the immediate action needed to keep myself and people around me safe. So this might be a punitive action that you wouldn't ideally want to do. It might be calling the police, it might be exclusion. But what's particularly helpful if you're working with someone who might get to that point on a fairly regular basis, actually agreeing with them beforehand, or just kind of stating the facts and saying, if you get to this point, if your behaviour reaches this point, if you're physically aggressive, for example, we will have to phone the police or we will have to exclude you. They've had that prior warning, so they still might respond badly at the time, but when you're debriefing with them afterwards, you'll be able to say to them, you know, we've had this conversation already, we've planned for this, it reached this point, this was the action that we said we were going to take, and unfortunately we did have to take that action to keep everyone safe. So often we know this implicitly within the staff team, but the more we can really empower the people that we're supporting by helping them to understand that these will be our responses to these actions, you might find that over time people are able to reflect more, because you're making it really explicit, even if you think it's obvious. So we're going to do a little bit of practicing together on these tools. When I'm using the term emotion regulation, this could be synonymous with stress management. And what I don't mean by this is suppressing emotions. So people often think that managing emotions or managing stress means not feeling anxious, not feeling angry, not feeling stressed, which is not the case. All emotions, again, evolutionarily, are helpful. They're giving us messages about the situation, and then our job is to reflect on those emotions and make a decision about what to do next. So when we're talking about regulating emotions, we're talking about connecting with them and acknowledging them, but not allowing them to take over. So the analogy I use at work quite a lot in terms of anger is, imagine you have a dog, pet dog, and this dog is just going around attacking everybody willy-nilly. You can't sort of control it. So this would be a situation where somebody's often losing their temper. And again, what we often find is if people lose their temper a lot, they often feel very remorseful and ashamed afterwards. It's often something that they are aware of, and negatively affects them when they go and reflect on that. So what we want to do is we want to keep the dog. We don't want to get rid of the dog, so that, you know, we don't want to completely suppress all of our emotions, but we want to train the dog to stay on the lead. So that way we can tell the dog what to do. We want the dog to be able to obey us, whether it's just to kind of growl at someone and give them a bit of a warning, or if somebody physically attacks you, you'd want the dog to attack back. So as an analogy for anger, I find this quite useful, because we're not sort of telling people to be vulnerable. We're not telling people to get rid of their anger. We're not telling them not to defend themselves. We're just saying, let's get this dog on the leash so that you can choose when to use it. And these techniques help you to do that. So they're great to teach to people we're supporting. And again, if this would primarily be if you're working with clients, at least for kind of a couple of weeks. Over time, this can help people learn to manage their own emotions. But even if you're a day service and you only ever see people once, we need to use these tools as well. So we have this classic graphic here of putting your own oxygen mask on first. So this goes back to this idea of, in a crisis situation, our fight and flight system is going to switch on. So if your default is fight and flight, fight or flight, you want to be doing the breathing, which is going to bring down your sympathetic nervous system, your fight and flight system. It's going to calm yourself. You might want to be doing the walking away if you know that you know, a client is shouting at reception and that's really triggering you. It might be the most appropriate thing to move away from that. If you know that you're a freezer, then the best tool would be grounding. So we're going to practice all these in a second, but just bear that in mind. So grounding is really good for freezing. Actually, grounding is good for pretty much anything. If you're having a panic attack, if you're feeling very anxious, it's good for anger, but it's not good to tell someone else to do if they're angry, because that's not going to go down very well, which is why you need to prepare people first. But you could do it yourself if you know that you're angry, and it's going to be helpful. And in terms of practicing, the analogy I use for this is, think of these tools like vegetables in terms of your physical health. If you eat one piece of broccoli once a year, your overall physical health is not going to be any better. It's not going to make any difference to you. But if you regularly eat vegetables, you're not going to feel super healthy after one portion of veg, but it accumulates over time. And these tools are exactly the same. So people often say, oh, I know how to breathe. I always breathe. Or I tried it once, it didn't work. And it's like, okay, fair enough. But if you think about it like a vegetable, you have to be practicing these things. I recommend people practice them daily, a couple of times a day even, because you can do the breathing and the grounding you can do in 30 seconds, 60 seconds. And this isn't meditation, so it's very, very simple, basic tools to practice. You can do them anywhere. And then, yeah, adding up over time, it just gives you that. It gives you more of a pause. So rather than your threat system going from 0 to 100 instantly, which again, we often see in our day-to-day work, people going from 0 to 100, it prolongs that process. So if you're able to recognize your emotions and pause and do some of these, then it's going to take you longer to get up to 100, and you're more likely to be able to de-escalate. So let's have a practice together. So with the deep rhythmic breathing, physiologically, if you can get your breathing down to 5 or 6 breaths a minute, you're going to activate your parasympathetic nervous system, which is your soothing system. And whether or not you're cognitively engaged with the exercise, so you might be thinking to yourself, this is really stupid, why am I doing this breathing? On a physiological level, it's actually going to be helpful. So there's an app which I'm going to use so that we can practice this together. It's called Breathe Easy, and I highly recommend this if you've got a service mobile or a service iPad or something that you can use with clients. Very simple interface. It's just a shape, and it expands and contracts, and you follow it. It gives you this visually grounding visual image to follow as you're breathing, and you can set the number of seconds that you breathe in and out for. So we're going to do this together just for a minute. Again, not meditation, you don't have to close your eyes, just sit in your chair, unfold yourself if you've got arms and legs crossed, and I will, because you can't see my app, I'll just talk you through the breathing. So start by breathing in. We're going to go for 6 breaths a minute here. And out. So when you breathe in, breathe down into the bottom of your stomach. In, like a balloon is inflating in your tummy. And out. In. And out. Really focus on the out breath. So really blowing that breath all the way out. In. And out. And if you feel yourself getting a bit lightheaded, just take a bit less in breath. In. And out. In. And out. We'll do one more. In. And out. So hopefully that was sort of a comfortable breathing rhythm. I'm quite petite, so I've got quite small lungs, and I find that one okay. That gets you down to 6 breaths a minute. And if you can elongate that even more, that's even better. As I said, sometimes when people do breathing exercises, they feel a bit dizzy, or equally when people feel anxious, they think, oh, I'm dizzy, I'm going to faint. And you're not usually. It means that you're taking in too much oxygen. which is why I always encourage people to focus on that out breath. And it's the out breath that's going to be your best friend with that exercise. So that's a great one. Super simple. Practice it yourself. Do it at the beginning of every handover, every team meeting. Get yourselves in the room. Do it at the beginning of every session when you sit down with a client. People will get used to it, and this will benefit everybody if you do it regularly. So the other one is grounding. Normally I get people to interact with this, but again, I can't hear you. So you can have a practice where you are. If you're in a room with somebody, maybe you can tell them. So my favorite grounding technique is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I always say, if you can remember the order of this, you've grounded yourself already, because it goes through the 5 senses. So first of all, look around and name 5 things that you can see. So I can see my water, I can see my phone, I can see a notebook, I can see a chair, and I can see my laptop. Then you do 4 things that you can touch them as you say them. So I can touch the table, my laptop, my watch, and my trousers. Then you have 3 things you can hear. So I can hear my own voice, I can hear the computer whirring, and I can hear some traffic outside. Then 2 things you can smell. So you can usually cheat a bit on this one. If you've got coffee next to you, you can smell your coffee. Or if you're wearing a jumper, you can smell your laundry detergent on your jumper. And then finally, 1 thing you can taste, which people often say, I can taste my own mouth, which is fine. Or again, if you happen to be having a coffee, then you can taste that. So the aim of grounding is literally to bring you back into the room. It's to ground you back into the present moment. When we're angry, when we're anxious, when we're in fight and flight and freeze, in general, we are not in the moment, we're not in the room. So our anxiety has taken us to the future, we're catastrophizing, we're worrying, we're dissociated. Even when we're really depressed, we're ruminating, we're in the past. So grounding is a great catch-all. And as I said, if you ever see someone having a panic attack in public, get them to do that. Along with some breathing. So ground them first, get them to do some breathing. It's really good kind of first aid tool for when people are upset. Little caveat, if someone's very angry, don't go up to them and tell them to name 5 things or do some breathing. That's not going to go down well unless you've done lots of practice with them and agreed that that's a good strategy. So they are good for anger, but only with consent, if that makes sense. The other one, actually, I've just realised it isn't on here, but is super helpful, again, for yourselves and for those you're supporting, is simply labelling emotions. So we tend to take this for granted that, oh, well, we all know what emotions are, but that's not true. So human beings learn how to label their emotions through positive interactions when they're young. And we all do this, don't we? Automatically, as soon as we're around a baby or a small child, we start going, oh, aren't you happy? Or, oh, you fell over. Oh, you're sad. Oh, you're hungry. And we tend to sort of verbalize, we narrate their experiences. And we'll say things like, oh, well, rub it better and you'll be okay. So you're labeling their experience and then you're showing them how to sort of self-soothe, in a sense. And over time, as human beings, we internalize this ability. So the more emotionally literate the environment that you grew up in, the more you will be able to recognize your emotions in adulthood. So if you grew up in an environment, whether it was school or home or anywhere that you spent time in your childhood, where people talked about their emotions, I am feeling, you are feeling. That's how you learn this skill. But many people didn't have those experiences. So as adults, we might grow up to just feel really uncomfortable and not be able to put a word on it. And that's really step 1, actually, before you can do anything else, is if you can't label your emotion, you can't manage it. So I have learned over time to label when I'm hungry, as opposed to just in a bad mood. And I know what to do about it. I can recognize it, I can label it, and I will go and get myself a snack. So that's an example of being able to label and do something about it. Whereas if I wasn't able to be aware of that, then I wouldn't feed myself and I just carry on being hungry. And maybe snapping at people around me. So you can find lots of tools online for this. There are feelings wheels, which there are many versions of. Some are more simple, some are more complex, and you can pick the ones that suit your needs. There's literally feelingswheel.com is one of them. You can print that off, put it up in your office, and practice labeling your own emotions. It never ceases to surprise me if I go around at the beginning of a reflective practice group and I ask people, how are you feeling? You get lots of fines, lots of okays, and then you might get some responses which aren't feelings. So, oh, I feel like I need a holiday, or I feel like I've got so much work to do. Those aren't feelings, they're not emotion words. So this is something, again, practice it at the beginning of team meetings. With clients, where I work, sometimes I just print off emojis, because actually even the basic emotions like anger and anxiety aren't labeled or recognized. So when you're trying to get people to recognize those basics, just stick with really simple emojis and just talk them through it. So talk to them about, like, okay, when you feel angry, what does it feel like in your body? Because all emotions are physiologically based. So what's your personal anger response? Maybe your ears get hot, or maybe your jaw feels tight, so that they can learn to recognize before they've reached that kind of 100, I can't do anything about it, I'm seeing red. They learn over time, like, oh, hang on, my jaw's tightening, I'm starting to feel angry, I need to walk away. And this is something that you can really train people to do over time, and it's incredibly helpful. If you can upskill people. So again, coming back to this kind of empowering and supporting people to sort of be able to manage their own emotions, which in turn is going to make them happy. Okay, so we're going to have a little comfort break. We're going to have a break until past. So I'll give you 10 minutes to grab a coffee. And in the meantime, if you have any questions about what we've covered so far, put them in the Q&A. And then when we come back, I can try and answer some questions before we move on to part 2. And again, you can also message me on the chat. In the meantime, I'll turn my video and microphone off for the break, but I'll still be around. So ask questions, talk to me in the chat, and then we'll come back together at 12:30. Okay, it's past, so hopefully people have come back from their break. I'm just going to assume that everybody's still there because I can't see people. Feel free to say hello to me in the chat if you've come back from your break. We didn't have any Qs or As, or any Qs rather, in the last 10 minutes, but Stephen has made a very good point, which I missed at the time in the discussion, but it's really worth going back to. So when I was talking about statutory services and not necessarily supporting us to work preventatively, Stephen's made a very good point that actually if we have good relationships with the services, so for example, the duty sergeants, as an example, your local safe neighbourhood team, or with the mental health services, with the CMHTs, care coordinators, etc., the better the relationships we build, the better they will respond to us, and they'll know when, if we know that something's brewing and we know the clients very well, they'll learn to trust our judgment on it and they'll be more supportive. So thank you very much, Stephen, for pointing that out, and that does in fact answer that sort of question which I'd left hanging, so that's great. So our next section, this is the de-escalation techniques that people have been asking about. Hopefully those people who are asking about that in the first couple of minutes are back from their coffee breaks to talk about this. So this is a little table which shows conflict escalating strategies versus conflict reducing strategies. And again, self-reflection comes in here too, because we're all human beings, we're not robots. And it's difficult to self-reflect on our weaknesses, but as a team, or with colleagues that you trust, or even friends and family at home, if you can learn to be aware of times when you might be triggered into doing some of these conflict escalating strategies, that'll really help everybody, because you'll bring that awareness into the situation, and you'll be able to think, actually, I need to approach this in a different way. So when we're in fight and flight mode, we tend to want to defend ourselves, and it can be quite benign. So maybe a client has come to you and they're angry because you forgot to post a letter yesterday. You said you were going to post it, you haven't posted it. And maybe you were really busy, or maybe they're angry because they think you've done something which you haven't done. And this happens all the time in our service, where someone will say, you told me that, I was going to hear from Pip today. Told me. And it's like, well, no, what we said is that we don't know when we're going to hear from Pip. So you actually know that they're mistaken. And this is where we need to remember that different people's perceptions may be different, and we want to get away from this kind of, there is a right way and a wrong way to view this situation. So if we were doing conflict escalating, we'd focus on our position and we'd say, no, you're wrong, you've got this wrong. So we're focusing on the other person. It's all about you. You're yelling at me, stop yelling, you're yelling, you've got this wrong, you've made a mistake. We try to sort of defend ourselves, which is really fair enough, but in a professional situation it might not be the most helpful thing to do. So saying, no, I was just really busy yesterday, it wasn't my fault. Trying to change the other person's view, asking leading questions, so sort of basically trying to get the other hand and interrupting, so talking over them, being critical. You shouldn't be shouting at me, I haven't done anything wrong, you always shout at me, focusing on the past, blaming. And again, I'm not suggesting that you might be wrong in saying any of those things. All of those things might be true technically, but what we need to consider is, are they going to be helpful in this situation? And again, the nice thing about these ideas is that we can extend them to our day-to-day life as well. So what do we want to do then instead? How can we reduce conflict? So this is this classic sort of how to have an argument well sort of idea. So we want to focus on ourselves if possible. So talking about how how you're feeling in the situation. So you're expressing your needs, and what this does is it helps the person to be able to empathize with you, be able to see your point of view. Because remember, we said that when you're in fight and flight, the part of our brain that allows us to see other people's point of view is kind of shut down. And again, for some of the people we support, actually that aspect of their neurology may not have been well developed in the first place if they weren't empathized with, if people didn't see their point of view much throughout their life, they're going to find it really hard to see your point of view. So making it clear where you stand, focusing on the behavior. So this is not saying that you can't assert boundaries. You definitely assert boundaries, but do it kindly, benignly, and focusing on the behaviors. So when you're shouting at me, I find it really difficult to actually support you. And what I want to do right now is understand and help you. So you're expressing concern while being assertive, but you're focusing on the behavior. So you're not saying, don't swear at me, don't be rude. You're saying, actually, when you shout, I find it hard to really hear what you're saying. Communicating clearly. Many of our clients, many of the people we support, have information processing issues for a variety of reasons. People have had a lot of head injuries. People, there might be some undiagnosed learning disabilities or ASD. There's quite a lot of that in the homelessness sector. They may be under the influence of substances, which is reducing their ability to process information. And when we get agitated, we have a habit of sort of talking at people and run-on sentences. And what's really important is just to slow down and just state a couple of sentences just quite clearly. There's a technique that you might have heard of called the broken record technique, which is essentially doing that. So if you're trying to, if somebody's been really aggressive and you're trying to get them to leave, you know, it's please stop shouting and leave reception. And then you might just need to keep saying that, please stop shouting and leave reception. We will have to call the police if you continue to be aggressive. Please stop shouting and leave. So they have a chance, but you're not escalating. So the broken record technique is about keeping yourself on a level without getting higher and higher and higher in your tone of voice each time. Trying to understand and being empathic. So I put empathy in this big sort of sun thing here because it really is your secret weapon here. So think about any time you've ever tried to call a customer service phone line. You've been on hold for 45 minutes. You're pissed off to start with. You're even more pissed off for being on hold for 45 minutes. They pick up. You really just want to yell at them. You know it's not their fault. You're still likely, I'll speak for myself, I'm still quite likely to snap at them. What I want from them is not to shut me down. I just want them to empathize with me and say, that sounds really frustrating. I'm really sorry that this happened to you. It's not about them saying, oh, it was my fault. They're not, you know, the person on the other end of the phone isn't saying, oh, I'm really sorry that I lost your package. They're just saying, I'm sorry that this has happened. I'm sorry that you're feeling like that. So we can empathize without, in that example where the person on the other end of the interaction is blaming you for something that you feel you haven't done, that's okay. You can still acknowledge their point of view and empathize with it without saying, oh, yes, it was my fault. I'm sorry. You just see their point of view. And yeah, trying to understand and find a solution. So when I'm on the phone to this person at customer service, I want them to try and be helpful. Okay, what can we do about this? Your package is lost. I'm sorry, I can't personally find it, but what's going to help in this situation right now? So again, it may not be about you know, having a magic wand and getting that hit decision right away, because actually it's going to take a few weeks, but it's about saying, being creative with it really and saying, what can we do, you know? And if you're having an awareness of the anger iceberg in the moment, this gives you more options. So if you're thinking, actually, you know, maybe they're just feeling really, really worried that they're not going to get the PIP, and that's why they're stressed and they're shouting at me, you might offer them a cup of tea and a chat and a walk. So maybe, you know, are you worried that the decision's going to be a no? Do you want to talk about that? So trying to get beneath that anger iceberg, and then focusing on the future and negotiating. So sort of moving forward. So if they're focusing on the past and blaming, trying to be future focused in terms of solution and problem solving, And then the final one on there is remove the audience. So this has a double whammy. So a lot of times people, they sort of start becoming angry, and then it becomes quite difficult for them to de-escalate and save face. So if you take away the audience, it'll be less sort of shaming or embarrassing for them to sort of actually calm themselves down and more quickly say, do you know what, I'm sorry, I overreacted. Whereas if there's lots of people watching, it's gonna keep going because the stakes are higher. This is particularly in my personal experience at the hostel I'm in, when someone's very intoxicated, and actually when someone's very, very intoxicated, none of this is going to work. So if somebody's like really blackout drunk, they're not going to hold in mind what you've been saying to them. They'll keep losing it. They'll keep being upset. And the more people are around, the more it escalates. So sometimes in those situations where we've tried everything else and nothing else has worked, everybody walks away. Even if it means leaving reception unattended for a minute or two, we just evacuate the area, and they will often just calm down because there's no one to shout at, or they'll get bored and wander off or get distracted. So removing the audience is a really powerful de-escalation technique as well. So this is just a little sort of 5-step conflict resolution model. So again, this is something more to be done in hindsight. You can do some of it in the moment, but it's sort of a reflective tool. And you can maybe use this one in team meetings or things like that. So identifying the problem, what's happened, what was the trigger, and identify the feelings. So if we're working in a less psychologically informed way, it tends to be, things like, oh, well, she said that and he said that and this happened and it was raining, and it's all about the context. Whereas actually, if we can understand what the feelings are and actually think, I think she was feeling really rejected, and I think that's why this triggered. You're going to have a lot more mileage and be able to resolve the conflict far better. Identifying the impact of the problem. So sort of what was the implication of this conflict, and also the underlying issue that's causing the conflict. Decide whether to resolve the conflict. This is an interesting one and a sort of a longer tangent that we won't go down. But there are times when sometimes it's better just to leave things be. There was an example from a group the other day where there was a Housing First worker and their client had a big bust up with a neighbour, and then was moved back into the same building. So the professionals could have actually continued to escalate the situation by fighting it and saying, no, they can't be in the same place, they've had a conflict before. In the event, it blew over, and they were okay with each other. So actually, can it just blow over? Can we just kind of move on and distract? If not, then how can we resolve the problem? So this might seem quite obvious, but again, don't forget that in a crisis, we're not thinking clearly. It's really easy to sit here today and go, oh, of course I'd do that. But in the moment, just knowing this, having a step-by-step is really helpful, just to think, okay, let's have a guide for what we're doing in this moment where none of us can think. So now we're going to do another experiential exercise here. So this is a kind of mindfulness, it's not entirely mindfulness. It comes from compassion focused therapy as a model, which does draw heavily on mindfulness. And we're going to use that technique of activating our parasympathetic nervous system, our soothing system, and we're going to essentially wrap up everything that we've talked about up to this point. So we're going to think about ourselves in the situation and what triggered us. We're going to think about the perspective taking, and then we're going to try to think about some sort of ways that sort of conflict can be de-escalated. So as I said before, this is not a use in the moment tool. This is a use in hindsight to reflect on tool. You can get this script online as well if you Google Tending the Friend, and I'll read off the script now. So I'd like you, wherever you are, to just again unfold arms and legs, and sit comfortably in your chair. If you feel comfortable, close your eyes. If not, just have a soft focus somewhere so you don't get too distracted. And we're going to start off by doing that anchoring breath. So I want you to breathe all the way in, feeling that balloon blowing up in your tummy, and then all the way out. Just take a couple of those, and maybe breathe out any tension you can feel in your jaw or your fists or your shoulders. And just bring to mind, for the purpose of the exercise, a really minor conflict. So nothing too upsetting, just something that was, you know, not very significant, where you got a little bit annoyed, a little bit defensive, so nothing that's going to upset you too much. And I want you to imagine that situation as if you're watching a movie. So watch the situation unfold. Try and remember the contextual factors, where you were, who was around. Try and visualize it as best you can. And then at the moment where you're feeling sort of the most agitated or triggered, just hit pause on that video and say to yourself, okay, let's take a moment and revisit this and understand more fully what's going on. So once again, take a breath. We're going to do this throughout to keep grounding ourselves. Take a nice deep breath again and relax any tension that's crept in. Let your jaw soften. And first of all, just try to sense your best intention in addressing this conflict. So what's actually important to you here? Is it the fact that you actually care about the other person? That you really do want to support them? Maybe it's a colleague and actually you want to be able to work with them harmoniously. Start off by just thinking, what's your best intention here? Now I want you to enter the movie. So I want you to step into your own shoes and just connect with how you were feeling in the moment. So let yourself feel your own agitation and try and notice where it is in your body. So this is this emotion labeling. Label the emotion. Notice how that feels physically. And then if you can, go below the anger iceberg. What's underneath the anger? Are there any more vulnerable emotions in there? Are you actually feeling a bit hurt or a bit powerless? A bit ashamed? What's going on for you? What's the root of the anger? And as you're doing that, if you can, just bring some kindness and compassion to yourself in this moment. Think to yourself, you know what, this is a really tough situation. And if it was a friend in this situation, you know, I tell them it's all right to feel like this. I'd feel like that too. Bringing that compassion in. Now zoom back out again. Take another breath and kind of feel yourself grounded in your chair. Feel that tension release again. And next, I want you to step into the other person's shoes. So this can be a bit harder. So same process, really. Step into their shoes and think about what's going on for them. How are they feeling? And if you can, what's underneath it? Maybe they're feeling a bit rejected. Maybe they're feeling not cared for. Maybe they're feeling like their needs aren't getting met in that moment. Just try and sort of really empathise with their experience, just from their point of view. And come back out. Take one more breath. Release any more tension that's crept in. And finally, I just want you to think, what really needs to be said here? How might you communicate in a way that's honest and makes your needs heard, but that's also non-blaming and that also takes into account their feelings? So you don't want to arouse any more defensiveness. You don't want to escalate any further. What needs to be said right now that actually takes both of your needs into account in this situation? And then finally, just take another couple of nice deep breaths. Maybe give yourself a little shake to shake off the memory, and come back into the room and open your eyes when you're ready. So some people find that really easy, some people find it really difficult. It's quite an advanced exercise, so if you found it hard, don't worry at all. It's a tricky one. All parts of it are tricky. It can be hard to think about our vulnerability. That's always painful. It can be hard to put ourselves in another person's shoes. It can be hard to know what the sort of compassionate thing to say at the end is. But again, if you can maybe do this as a team sometimes, as a reflective exercise, it's a really, really helpful one to practice. So we're going to shift focus now. We're going to talk about supporting people who are wanting to hurt themselves or perhaps wanting to end their lives. So basic risk assessment in terms of suicidality is really important and something that can be really daunting for people. So this goes back to this idea at the very beginning that actually the death, suicide, they're very taboo subjects for us as in our society. Death is a natural part of life, but we don't talk about it. Even when we have, when working with people who might be end of life or who are ill, we're quite averse to thinking about these ideas. And suicide in particular can carry a lot of negative connotation. It can be very stigmatized for obvious reasons. But when you're trying to support a client who's feeling like that, or a friend who's feeling like that, you want to be moving away from that taboo, away from that stigma. This is a little flowchart that I made for my team. And again, it's just that little crib sheet, that little rule of thumb. So maybe the person you're working with has just made a comment, might be quite a vague comment. It might be like, oh, I feel like there's no point being here anymore. When somebody's talking like this, we really need, as professionals, to figure out, are these passive thoughts or do they have a plan and intention? Because those are two completely different ball games. So to start with, on the right-hand side, if they only have the thought, that's really normal. If somebody's feeling very depressed, if somebody's gone through a lot of trauma, it's such a normal thought to have. I just wish this could be over. I wish this pain could just stop. I just wish I wasn't here anymore. That doesn't mean that they're going to act on thoughts. It's just a natural thought, and it's really helpful to normalize that for people if it is definitely just a thought, because it can be quite scary for people to have those thoughts. So really sort of encouraging them, like, thank you for sharing that with me. That must have been, really tough to share, but I really appreciate you being open with me about that. And it's really normal to have those thoughts when you're feeling like this. We obviously want to note that and provide that emotional support and keep monitoring the situation if they are feeling like that. If they have a plan or intention to act on the plan, then you need to take action, because that is a different kind of risk. If somebody's telling you, yes, I have been piling up my sedative medication and I'm planning to take it all this weekend, you need to do something about that. So first of all, you need to see, is this an imminent risk or not? If it is an imminent risk, so they're saying to you, yeah, actually, I'm not sure if I walk out of this room, I might act on this intention, 999 or A&E. That's an emergency and you need to do something about it. If they're willing to make a safety plan, so if they're saying, oh yeah, no, I've got a substance use appointment tomorrow and I'm planning to go to it, and yes, you can check on me during the night. Fair enough, make the safety plan and then monitor, flag to the relevant people. So hopefully that's quite a clear flowchart, and actually there's a couple more graphics in the next few slides which show this in various different ways. Always follow it up, obviously. So you want to be checking in on that risk regularly. And again, this goes back to this idea of planning and preparation. So if somebody is prone to having thoughts like these, definitely from when they first come into the service, create a crisis plan with them. So what are your triggers? How will we know? Do you withdraw? Will you talk to us? Give them the crisis numbers. So we always have some printed out to give the clients. So it could be SPA, it could be Samaritans, anything that they're going to find useful in these moments. Create that crisis plan with them in advance. So the next question is, how do we ask these questions? Because that's the tricky part. So most people are kind of quite clear on the process of this, but actually asking somebody, do you have a plan or intention, can be quite daunting if you're not used to doing it. As with everything in this training, I have to say practice makes perfect. So I know we all hate role plays, but in your team, if this is something that you're not comfortable with, practice it. Practice having these conversations. Get one of your colleagues to pretend to be the client and practice asking the questions, because it might feel uncomfortable. But what you need to be able to do in this situation is ask the questions confidently. Because if a client is bringing this content to you and you're squirming and you're like, oh, I'm really uncomfortable, I don't know what to say, you're sort of taking away their permission to be able to talk about this topic. So even if you're feeling uncomfortable, the best thing you can do for them is to be calm, collected and confident and just ask the questions plainly. So if someone, let's go back to the example, someone said, actually, you know, I just feel like there's no point being here anymore. You want to know, quite literally and basically, is that just a thought, or actually have you been thinking about how you might end your life? So just a confident, straightforward, clear question. And then if they do have a plan, are you likely to act on this plan, or is it a backup plan? So many of the people we work with have backup plans, but they'll tell you that. They'll say, oh yeah, no, I know how I'd kill myself, but I'm not going to do it. It's just a back pocket option. And that's fine. I say to people, okay, keep it as a back pocket option. Don't have it as a front pocket option. So thoughts, plan, intention is like the 3 steps of it. A really helpful question that I use quite a lot when people are ambivalent, and again, this is a really common situation, you're trying to figure out in your own mind, who do I need to inform? How urgent is this? I ask, do you feel able to keep yourself safe for the next 24 hours? If they can't say, that's a yes or no question. And if they can't say yes, then I explain to them that I will then need to either accompany them to A&E or call an ambulance if they're not willing to come with me, because that's an urgent situation. And what I've found before is that when people realise the implication of that, they're then more willing to make a safety plan with you. But I just find that a very helpful question, because it's a very clear way of figuring out imminent risk. The next few slides, as I say, are sort of reiterations of that, because it's quite an important skill to be able to do. So when you can watch back the recording and get the slides, you can pick your system. So this is just a similar idea. So emergency, you've got current suicidal thoughts with a plan, with means available and the intention. Or they've obviously, if they've already implemented the plan, that is clearly an emergency. So 999 immediately. The other sort of much higher risk, we'll go on to sort of risk escalating factors in a second, but if somebody's sort of recently come back from hospital after a suicide attempt and they're saying, actually, I'm still feeling suicidal, that's more of an emergency, because they've very recently acted on that. So urgent is they've got lots of history of it, no immediate plans or intents, but an idea about it. So that would be that line of the flowchart where you want to be flagging this urgently to people. So telling the GP, telling the care coordinator if there is one, making sure you've got a crisis plan, maybe agreeing that you're going to call them to check on them later. So making sure that you're really actively managing the risk. And then routine is the thoughts only column. So no history, they're just thoughts and they haven't got an intentional plan. And then you obviously just empathise, take it seriously, normalise and check in with them, but you don't have to take any emergency action on that. This is another slide that gives you some clear questions to ask. So you'd be, in your roles, you'd probably be less likely to ask the first one, but there might be times, particularly on an initial assessment, you might want to. As a psychologist, I'd ask this question quite a lot, even if somebody hadn't brought it up. And then again, just very plain questions. Do not be scared to ask these questions. How likely would you be to act on these thoughts? You can get them to put it on a scale of 1 to 10. Have you made any plans to act on these thoughts? To state the obvious, if people are saying no, you don't have to continue down this line of questioning. So if somebody says 0, I'm not likely to act on them and I don't have any plans, you don't need to ask them if they've made preparations. But if they've got a plan, ask them if they've got the means to act on that plan. Understanding if they've ever made attempts before is important, as I said, because that really escalates the risk. And then finally, and again, we're going to talk more about this in a second, really helpful to understand why they haven't acted on it. So what's stopping them? Because if you can understand those protective factors, you can sort of leverage those and get them to think more about the support and the reasons that they're not acting on these thoughts. So there might be some people out there thinking, oh, I don't want to ask these questions because I'll give them ideas. And that's a really common concern that people have. But it's a myth. So nobody is going to suddenly think this is a good idea just by being asked the question. They'll also not be offended by it. As I said, in my job, I risk assess all the time, including people who come to see me with really mild issues in my private work. I still have to ask them, do you have a history of this? Is this on your mind at the moment? People don't get offended. It's a routine part of the job. And you can say that if you're asking the question without them having brought you the idea, just preface it by saying, I've just got a couple of questions to ask you. They're routine. We ask everyone, so that it's, they're not thinking, oh, why are they asking me? But if somebody has actually told you that they're thinking about these things, again, you want to create a safe space that's containing so that they can talk about it, because it's tough to bring this up yourself. And you want to give them that permission and validation by actually asking what needs to be asked and not avoiding the subject. So asking them if they have a plan isn't going to make them suddenly make one. They either have a plan or they don't. So one myth is that people who talk about it never actually do it. Not true. People often have communicated some intent. I would caveat that by saying that there are times where people are really set on going through with it. So they might lie to professionals, they might not say anything. All we can ever do in this situation is our very best. But there will be times when we miss a risk, or when somebody, as I said, has actually sort of been very set on their course of action, and so they've not answered our questions honestly. I've had situations before where somebody has told me very clearly, no, I'm not at risk of hurting myself, and then 10 minutes later they've gone off and self-harmed, and that goes back to that impulsivity idea. And that links into the next myth. So it's a myth to say that if someone really wants to kill themselves, there's nothing you can do, because we can offer lots of support. We can help people understand that they might not be able to see the hope in this moment, but we can. When you're depressed, everything feels hopeless, but actually we can hold that hope for them, and help them, support them to get through this crisis. So you can do something about it. But same caveat, if somebody has ended their life, it's totally common for us to feel like this was my fault, I should have done more. If you've done everything possible, i.e. everything in these slides, there's not more you could have done, short of detaining people, which obviously we can do. We can't prevent someone if they're completely set on it. So I realise that sounds like I'm contradicting myself, but hopefully that makes some sense. So this isn't about blaming ourselves if someone's gone through with it. She wouldn't kill themselves because, so again, this slightly contradicts one of the protective factors, but just basically don't make assumptions is the point of that one. So just because somebody's got a dog and you think that they would care about the dog, we can't rest on our laurels, as it were. And same with this last one, that's the same point, is that we sometimes work with people who come to us every day. I'm going to go jump off the bridge, I'm going to go and take all my medication, you didn't post my letter, I'm going to take all my medication. And the danger is that we slip into this idea of thinking, oh, they always say that, they're not going to do it. This is about balance. So this isn't about calling 999 every time, but we do not want to fall into the trap of thinking they won't, because you don't know when someone's going to actually act on it. So we always have to take it seriously. So factors that increase risk are, as we said, the current plan and intent and previous suicide attempts. Being under the influence of substances makes you more impulsive, so that's going to dramatically increase the risk. Psychiatric diagnoses, so obviously suicidality will go hand in hand with, you know, depression and PTSD and all the sort of the labels. So if somebody's struggling with their mental health, that increases the risk. Impulsivity, as we've said, and hopelessness. So if somebody's really hopeless, that's a red flag in itself, really. Recent losses, recent discharge, family history of suicide, history of abuse, and a lot of these are interconnected, so I'm not kind of describing them one by one. And then that last one is just about statistics. So statistically, men are more likely to end their lives. I believe that might be something to do with the methods they choose are more sort of decisive. So yeah, statistically, some people are more likely to be in a higher risk category than others. And then importantly, the protective factors. So this is this question, what's stopping you from acting on these thoughts right now? Really important question to understand what's keeping people safe and informs our risk. So I've had many conversations where people have said, I really want to end my life. And I've thought about, I always think about how to do it. And then I get to this question and they say, oh no, I never do it. I never do it because I'm really spiritual. And I would just never actually do that because I really don't want to go to hell or something like that. So spirituality, or it might be I'd never do it because like my mom would be devastated, or I'd never do it because I wouldn't want to leave my dog. And people will say that really emphatically, and it really reduces the risk. It doesn't negate the risk, but it helps. So the most protective factors are a sense of positive social support, which we can provide. And that can go hand in hand with a positive therapeutic relationship. And we mean that broadly. So key workers, any support staff, your relationships with the people you support are inherently therapeutic because we're humans and you're supporting them. So positive relationships with professionals. Spirituality is a really strong protective factor if someone's got spiritual beliefs. And as I said, sense of responsibility to family, children, or pets is really protective. And that can help if you know someone's got kids and they've said before that they wouldn't want to do that to their kids. If they're feeling suicidal and that's not at the front of their mind, you can remind them of that. So that's why it's good to have this awareness of people's personal protective factors. So some life satisfaction and an intention to follow through with positive plans. So if somebody's saying, oh yeah, I've got my I don't know, passport interview next week, definitely going to go to that, or I'm seeing my mate on Friday, I'm really excited about it. That helps to know that the risk is slightly less because they're not intending to not be there. And then the coping skills and the problem solving skills are things that we can support people, again, empowering people, teach people coping skills, teach people emotion regulation techniques, teach people to understand that actually, you know, the way that they're feeling right now isn't all there is. They can actually build up their internal resources and their social resources and be able to cope with these problems more effectively going forwards. So in a nutshell, the most effective approach when a client is feeling suicidal is to be sort of compassionate, identify all the risks, ask clear questions confidently, whether or not you feel confident, practice asking the questions so that you can understand the level of risk at the time. And also, to state the obvious, record all of that. So if you've had this conversation, that needs to go straight onto your note system, so that if something does happen, you've got a record of what was said. Promote those protective factors, give them hope. So the thing I was just saying about holding hope for others, that conversation is best done when you have an existing relationship with somebody. But I've used this conversational tool several times with clients who have been working with me for a while, and I've talked about me being able to hold that hope and then over time giving it back to them. And create your safety plan in advance with them. So you know their triggers, you know the warning signs, they've got the crisis numbers, you know what you're going to do. Plan, plan, plan. So final section. The incident has happened. The crisis has already occurred. What now? So now it's about debriefing. It's about learning. It's about moving forward and trying to not blame ourselves, but reflect on, could anything have been done differently? Can we learn from this? Can we move forward? And alongside that, how are we feeling? What do we need in this time of crisis? So debriefing needs to be done as soon as possible, but I would recommend it also needs to be followed up, because often we're in shock after an incident and we need to feel like someone's there for us right away, but our responses can often develop over time. So if you're out there and you're a service manager, please keep this in mind, that your staff team, they might need an immediate debrief, but then you'll probably want to do another one in a couple of weeks' time. Don't think, oh, we've done the debrief, that's ticked off. Give them that follow-up, because yeah, our responses will develop. So debriefing is a technique, and the next slide, I believe, is our 7-step debrief technique. It's designed to assist ourselves as teams with dealing with the physical, meaning the practical implications, but also the psychological impact of a crisis. So it says ideally it should be conducted nearer on the site. Personally, normally that happens because we're working in a service, but I'm not sure that's essential. It might be that actually you want a bit of space from where the incident occurs, and you might find it more helpful to carry it out somewhere else. Again, it allows you to label your emotions. So we're actually being able to understand how we feel. Don't worry if in the immediate aftermath you don't know how you feel. Again, we're often in shock, we're often a bit disconnected, so labeling emotions is going to be really hard. And also we might have lots of conflicting thoughts and feelings, which makes it difficult to label, so that's also very normal. So what's the standardized procedure that we're talking about? This is a 7-step debriefing protocol, which I can send around if people would like this. So this was developed by someone called Joseph Davies. So the first thing we want to do is assess the impact of the critical incident on the people who were involved. So this is about talking about what happened. So if you remember, I said a little earlier that our memories in a crisis are going to be a bit fragmented because our brain physically processes memories differently when we're in fight and flight. So we want to put the pieces of the puzzle together. So get the different perspectives, allowing different perspectives. There might be contradictory perspectives about what happened, but these are subjective ideas around this was my experience. So allowing people to kind of talk about that. Avoiding sort of why questions. We want to be non-blaming. So, well, why did you grab him? You shouldn't have done that. We don't want people to feel blamed or shamed. We just want to normalize that actually we do our best in a crisis. We were in fight and flight mode, and if we did do something that we shouldn't, in quotes, have done, then okay, let's learn from that. But it happened, and we're not going to sit here and feel bad about it. So identify immediate issues surrounding the problem. So if there is, I don't know, maybe the security door needs to be fixed so that people can feel safe again. Maybe staff have been asking for CCTV for ages, and actually this has really highlighted the need for it. Is there any quick wins that we can do in terms of safety and security? Do we need to, I don't know, get some more walkie-talkies? What do we need to do to make staff feel safe and clients feel safe? So then we want to be able to allow people to sort of ventilate, it says, but to be able to process, really, to be able to label their thoughts, emotions and experiences. again, without being blaming. So you can talk about fight and flight specifically here. What threat emotions were you feeling? What were you aware of? How did that influence your response? And helping people to normalize it. So really easy example here. I have a colleague who's also a freezer, and he was physically threatened by a client at reception once, and he froze up and had to be guided away by a colleague. And afterwards, he was really beating himself up about it. And he was saying, "Oh God, I'm so bad in a crisis. I was useless. I just stood there. I did nothing." And actually helping him to understand that that freeze response is really normal and evolutionarily helpful takes away that shame. Or even just hearing your colleagues' experiences. So, "Oh, you were really scared as well." "Yeah, I was scared." And it normalizes and it helps. So then we can start looking to the future. So predicting reactions. So when I do debriefs, I talk to people about the responses of grief or of trauma, depending on the situation, whatever's relevant. And the fact that actually over the next few weeks, you might get some strong emotional responses. You might be feeling fine now because you're in, crisis mode, you're getting on with it. But maybe next week you'll feel a bit scared or a bit tearful, or you'll suddenly sort of remember something that you hadn't remembered before. And that's completely normal. Conducting a systematic review. So this now is about sort of what can we do as a service, as a system, to make sure this doesn't happen again. We're going to have a look at policies and procedures, all the boring paperwork stuff. Bringing closure to the incident. So thinking about what can we do to support ourselves to sort of put this to bed. So does anyone need extra support? Does anyone need referring to the employee assistance program? Is anyone feeling a bit traumatized by this? Do we need grief counselling? Sometimes we look at models like post-traumatic growth to be able to help people kind of move forward. And then finally, re-entry back into the workplace. So it might be about graded returns if somebody's needed to take some time off. It might be about how are we going to come back and make you feel safe. And again, it's very natural when we've been through something traumatic to feel fine until we're back at the place. So, for example, somebody has the unfortunate experience of finding a body in a room, and they might be okay until they go back to that corridor. And then suddenly it comes back to them. And that's natural in terms of trauma, but we need to be aware of it. We need to maybe preempt it, predict it, offer support. If that's not an issue for them, absolutely fine. But if it is, then we can deal with it at the time. That's a debrief protocol that we would recommend. So again, this is just in a nutshell. What did we do well? We never think about what we did well, but focusing on what went well. What could we have done differently? Is there any learning? Update the risk management plans as required. Update the environmental factors. Identifying sort of discrimination, if that was a root cause of it or that was part of the incident. Do we need to make sure that our service has, for example, a no tolerance policy towards racism? Are we reporting this and supporting people as we should be? Are there any recommendations for policy changes? So, warnings and sanctions. Let's say that this was an incident that occurred because someone who is being supported in your service did something that they shouldn't have, and they require a warning. To do psychologically informed warnings and sanctions, they need to be done in person, and they need to be supportive. So again, this is sort of part of another training really, but if we think about someone's sense of self, if they have had a whole life of being excluded, told they've done wrong, they've been arrested over and over again, they've been kicked out of schools, giving them a warning is going to be like water off a duck's back. It just fits with their sense of self. They're just going to think, yeah, I'm a bad person. The warning isn't going to create any behaviour change. The thing that creates behaviour change is positive reinforcement when somebody is doing better and actually getting support. You want to create a sort of a discrepancy between their sense of self and their reality by showing them that actually things can be different, and that sometimes they don't do that, or they don't respond like that, and that's a really good thing. And that's what's going to create the behaviour change. So this is just a little step-by-step of how to do a psychologically informed warning process. So again, empathy first and foremost, really understand what happened for the client, and then this can go into their future sort of safety plans or behaviour agreements. What happened? How did you feel? Can we identify the triggers? Then thinking about the person on the other side. So this is an example if it's between client and staff, but it might be between two clients. So what happened for the other person, basically the person who was on the receiving end of the incident. And again, this is not to be blaming, not to be judgmental, but so that the people involved can start to be able to empathise with each other. They can see each other's points of view. What do our policy and procedures have to say about this? So that's the sort of the legislative bit, if you like, of the warning. So actually, your license agreement says that you damage property. We're going to have to charge you for it. Or, you know, in our organisation, we have zero tolerance policy to racial abuse. So we can't just let that slide. We want everyone to feel safe. And then the plan moving forward. So supportive plan. What do you need to do that's different? And ideally not a list of don'ts, but a list of do's as well. So it might be about, rather than like don't swear and shout, it might be something like, you know, we treat you with respect and we would like you to speak to us with respect as well. So it's actually helping people to understand what you do want to see. So then when you follow it up, you can then positively reinforce that. So that's the magic part. You have to follow this up within a couple of weeks. And then anything that's good, even if it's a small thing that's good, even if they've partially kept to the agreement, positively reinforce it. And that's the bit that's going to really help. The last little section, someone mentioned vicarious trauma. So we're at risk of trauma and vicarious trauma. So if you've been on the receiving end of an incident, you may end up with trauma symptoms as a result of that. It's definitely not a necessary response. Many of us go through traumas and don't develop PTSD. But at the same time, for those of us who do develop these symptoms, it's a normal response to a very abnormal situation. Vicarious trauma is very similar, but that's from when we hear about someone else's traumatic experience. So I don't have a separate slide on that, but just be aware that even if the trauma didn't happen to you, you could still be left with some vicarious trauma symptoms which still need to be dealt with. So with PTSD, you will get that really strong reaction at the moment. And for, I'd say 1 or 2 weeks after the event, you might have some very strong emotional responses. You might have some very strong intrusive memories. Maybe you won't be able to sleep that night. Maybe you'll have a nightmare the next day. That's not PTSD, that's normal. That's your brain processing. What you want to watch is if these symptoms persist. So if a month after the event, you're still getting really strong heart palpitations every time you come into work, or you're still having nightmares, or you're still avoiding going down that corridor where it happens, this is where we're getting into going to needing help. The good news is that PTSD treatment is incredibly effective. Out of all of the psychological sort of difficulties that we have treatments for, PTSD treatment has the highest success rate because we actually understand what's going on with PTSD in the brain, which we don't have time to go into, but we understand the neuroscience of it. So the treatments are super effective. So what to watch out for? Intrusive, upsetting memories. So this might be a really vivid sort of reliving experience. So a flashback is different from a memory. A memory is, I had chicken salad for dinner last night and I can remember cooking it and I can remember eating it, but I know it happened yesterday. A flashback is, I can taste chicken. I can see the salad in front of me. I actually feel full, physically full right now. That's a flashback because I'm reliving physiologically what happened. And we can also get these at night in the form of nightmares. Intense physiological arousal, that's your fight and flight, heart racing, sweating, shaking, etc. when you get reminded of what happened. That can then get switched on. So if you have PTSD, you're likely to struggle with your sleep, your appetite, you're going to feel jumpy and on edge, you're going to be irritable. because that's your threat system getting stuck to the on position there. And again, think of our clients here who are often in this state, easily triggered. And then the other side, the sort of the shutdown side, is avoiding and feeling really numb and detached. So if you notice these in yourself or in a colleague, please just go to your GP, because there's really good treatment available. And then self-care in general. So what's helpful? Talk to your friends and family and your colleagues, go to supervision, use debrief and reflective practice. Allow your brain time to process. So don't try to shut out what happened. Don't think, oh, I should just be able to forget about this. This was just work. Allow the thoughts, the feelings in the initial aftermath. And there's a little trick called worry time, which can help here. You don't want these thoughts and feelings to overwhelm you and take up hours of your day. So if you're finding yourself becoming very preoccupied, set yourself a time, not just before bed. Do it maybe on your commute home or at 5 p.m. 15 or 20 minutes. You just sit and you let your brain do whatever it wants. Maybe it doesn't want to think about the event, but maybe you just allow it to worry. At the end of the time slot, you set a timer and then you plan something else to do. So cooking dinner, going for a walk. So this is great because it gives your brain some bite-sized chunks to process this, really big thing that's happened to you that needs processing without it taking over. And then what you do is at the rest of the day, when the thoughts pop in, because they will, you're not suppressing them. Is a subtle difference. What you're doing is saying, not now. You're saying, oh yeah, I hear you, we're remembering this, but I'm thinking about this at 5. I'm busy right now. And that goes back to mindfulness. That's the refocusing. But that's a really nice little tool that can help you process after a really significant event. Alongside that, acknowledging and working through thoughts of self-blame or others, blaming others rather. Guilt, really common, usually overinflated. Normally we really beat ourselves up about things when actually, in terms of the responsibility pie chart, who was responsible, we only usually have quite a small part, and maybe we did everything we could. General self-care, exercise, routine, sleeping, eating properly, resting, take some time off if you need to. And then just look out for the signs. Look out for PTSD, look out for burnout, both in yourselves and in colleagues. And then if possible, try not to use substances as a primary coping strategy. That's going to be less helpful, stops your brain processing it in the way that it needs to. Avoiding and thought suppression equally stops your brain processing what happens, so not very helpful. Withdrawing and shutting people out, and being hard on yourself. So these things are very natural, but generally not very helpful. So, in summary, there is no magic word in a crisis. I'm sorry. Prevention is better than cure. Once something's escalated, de-escalating is much harder than just preventing it in the first place. Be aware of your own triggers. So know what triggers you, make sure you're not accidentally escalating things. Empathy is your secret weapon, especially when people are really angry. Just remember what you're like when you're trying to get through to customer service phone lines. Empathy is going to help. Be aware of client triggers. Plan your emergency procedures. So again, this goes back to, in the moment, you are not going to be thinking clearly. Don't assume that this knowledge in your mind now is going to stay there in a crisis. And that links to this practicing the breathing, practicing the grounding. One analogy I use with clients a lot is if you learn a new football pass once and then you didn't use it again, and then you have a really important match in a month, are you going to be able to use it effectively in the match when you're stressed? No. It's the same with the breathing. If you think you need to be able to calm yourself and ground yourself in the moment, practice it, or it's not going to come to your mind to do it. Explicitly assess for suicide risk. Don't be scared of having those conversations, and debrief and learn from incidents. So that's it. So we are at time. Were there any other questions in the last 30 seconds? I had left the Q&A time actually, but we slightly run past. If there are any questions, let me know. Also, you've got my email address there, so if people do want to ask me further questions, you can email me if there's anything.
Thank you so much for that, Natalie. That was really, really interesting. And we really appreciate that you took the time to be in our annual conference today. So as Natalie said at the beginning, we'll be posting those recordings for the sessions in the website, and we'll notify everybody when they're up. So thank you everyone for tuning. I hope that you found it as interesting as I did. And just a reminder that in 10 minutes, we've got our final session of the conference with a panel discussion with representatives from all 4 nations. So hopefully see you there. But thank you again, Natalie, and everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.